Well, good evening. I want to welcome you all here. It's wonderful to see so many people in Zellerbach. As you know, this is something of a tradition for the journalism school, and it gives us great pleasure to be able to provide occasions to gather people like you together to consider some of the important issues that confront us, our country, and the world. Today, we are going to have a very unusual event that's being hosted by Michael Pollan, who, as you all know, is a wonderful writer, one of the clearer thinkers that I know, a great teacher, and a wonderful colleague as well. He's author of The Botany of Desire, and most recently, The Omnivore's Dilemma. And he's been having a dialogue with our guest tonight, and I'll let him introduce the event in a moment. But I also want to mention that as part of Michael's program, he is the holder of the Knight Chair in Science and Environment Reporting at the Graduate School of Journalism. There will be another event on March 21st on the Farm Bill, which for those of you who care about this subject is going to be a momentous occasion. And that will be at 7 o'clock, March 21st in Wheeler Auditorium. So please join me in welcoming Michael Pollan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very kind. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Orville. And thanks for coming out on such a rainy night to talk about food. Before I introduce John Mackey, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about how this somewhat improbable event came about. Some of you know the story, but many of you perhaps do not. The story begins last spring with the publication of my book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, in which, if you've read it, you might agree that I had a few slightly unflattering things to say about Whole Foods in a chapter entitled Big Organic. I spoke there of the industrialization of organic agriculture and looked into some of the beguiling stories about food and farming on offer in the store, a literary genre I called supermarket pastoral. I raised a few questions about the extent to which Whole Foods is walking its talk about things like local, organic, and sustainable food. And in passing, I mentioned an unhappy experience I'd had with some Argentinian organic asparagus I had bought from the Whole Foods on Ashby. Shortly after the book came out, I got an email from John Mackey's office asking me to pay him a visit when I was in Austin on book tour. So I went up to the executive offices and met John for the first time. He handed me an 11-page, single-spaced letter taking issue with my portrayal of the company and a $25 gift certificate to make up for the lousy asparagus. We sat and we talked for an hour and a half in his office about Whole Foods, about where organic is going, animal welfare, and the future of food. At the end of the meeting, he asked if I would mind if he posted his letter to me on his website. I said not at all, but asked if he would in turn post my response. So began an exchange of emails that stretched into the summer. And if you haven't read them, they're available both on his website at Whole Foods and mine at michaelpollan.com. I'm sure we'll touch on some of the issues it covered this evening, but it was, I think, an unusually productive exchange, critical but open-minded on both sides, mutually enlightening, I think, and I'm told it played some small part in helping to generate several, I think, very important new Whole Foods initiatives having to do with local farming and pastured livestock. In my last letter to John, I invited him to come to Berkeley to continue our exchange in public, on stage. His initial response was cool. He said, in effect, "Just how crazy do you think I am?" John pointed out that I would enjoy an unfair advantage, not just because this is Berkeley, my home turf, but because I am a writer fortunate enough to work in the realm of the ideal, while he is a businessman who must take account of the realities of the marketplace every day. Point taken. But I persisted, explaining that the Berkeley audience was far more civil and open-minded than he might think, and that I would do my part to keep the tone as elevated and constructive as our emails had been, that I was not interested in scoring points in a debate so much as having a conversation and not just about whole foods, but the larger issues of the future of food. John eventually agreed to come to my delight, but asked that since I had already had 450 pages to lay out my views about the food system, he should at least have enough time to adequately present his own very well-developed views on the matter. So that's the format tonight. John will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will pick up the thread of our conversation. After a while, we'd like to involve the audience, and the ushers have cards that you can write questions on, questions for either or both of us on the subject of food. Please pass them to the aisles when you're done, after John is done speaking or later if you like. And for those of you watching the webcast, you too can pose questions. Email them to futureoffood@gmail.com, and with luck, they will find their way up to us here on the stage. Now it is my pleasure to introduce John Mackey. John co-founded Whole Foods Market in Austin in 1980 when he was 25 years old. Since then, he has helped build the chain into a $5.6 billion Fortune 500 company. For many years, the fastest-growing food retailer in the country, Whole Foods played a critical role in the growth of the market for organic food, as well as sustainable and humanely raised meat and dairy. In my view, the company's phenomenal success over the last few years is a really important barometer of America's growing dissatisfaction with the industrial food chain. Whole Foods, by virtue of its buying power and market dominance, will have a lot to do with deciding the future of food in America, which sometimes makes the company a lightning rod. As the company's CEO, Mackey is decidedly not your typical Fortune 500 executive, as I suspect you're about to discover. His willingness to engage with critics sets him apart from just about every other CEO in the food industry. And that, as much as anything else, has earned my admiration. Of him, the New York Times Magazine once wrote that on the scale of CEO bluntness, with Ted Turner a 10, Mackey would rate an 8, or on a good day, which I suspect this will be, a 9. And on the scale of CEO complexity, he would be simply off the charts. Please join me in welcoming John Mackey.
First, I've got to touch my microphone now. Can people hear me okay? Too bad. Okay, I'll try to talk louder. Is that better? Yeah, Michael's introduction was kind of my introduction. But first, I'm very grateful to be invited to come here today and face some of my critics. And I just want to take a quick poll. How many people here have read The Omnivore's Dilemma? Okay. All right. How many people here have read my book? So I am at a little bit of a disadvantage. But, you know, like many of you, The Omnivore's Dilemma had a big impact on me. I mean, it was a brilliant book. And it really caused me to re-examine a lot of the things that Whole Foods is doing and take kind of a mission check, see if we're still on course. And it was catalytic. I mean, I did disagree with a lot of the things Michael said about Whole Foods, but you know, some of the things he said kind of hit home. Some of them were true, or a little bit true. And it's caused us to rethink kind of our approach to business. And so what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to paint a really big picture of really the entire food system. If you go to audible.com and you try to download The Omnivore's Dilemma, you'll find out it takes about 19 hours to listen to it. And Michael would not agree to let me speak for 19 hours. But I do have about an hour speech that I'm going to race through to get it into 45 minutes. So I'm going to trust the intelligence of the audience because I'm going to put the slides up there, and I'm only going to probably hit a bullet point or two on a lot of them, so to press on, because I know we want to get to the dialogue and then the question and answer. So let's rocket forth. I believe that we can identify 6 different food eras. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the first 4, hunting and gathering, horticulture, pastoral, pre-industrial agricultural. But the last 2 I'm going to talk about, industrial a bit, and then the paradigm that I think has been born in our lifetime, which I call the ecological era, that I want to spend most of my time talking about. That's what I think we're all interested in and excited about, and I've got some interesting views on it. So just real quickly on the hunting and gathering area, I think the thing to recognize about this is it went on for about 400,000 years. At least if you were to do a time scale of all the other forms of food production, this takes up, 98, 99% of it. We evolved as hunters and gatherers. It's in our DNA, it's in our genetic structure. But global warming after the last ice age, extinction of some of the major species, and just the continued evolution of human food technologies, we began to move into more of a horticultural era, where it probably coexisted with hunting and gathering for probably tens of thousands of years. But from an anthropological standpoint, we think it began we have evidence for about 12,000 years ago. Interestingly enough, horticulture still exists today in the form of local food markets. A lot of the local food is being produced by horticulturists, or really gardeners, who are producing it in small batches and small scale. And hunting and gathering is obviously still going on today as well. Michael had a whole chapter in his book on it. And of course, most of the fish that we consume today is from the form of hunting and gathering. The pastoral systems, where we domesticated animals and then followed the flocks around, probably about 8,000 years before the present day. And it took advantage of marginal agricultural land, and it was really a stimulant for trade and commerce around the world. And we still have cultures in our planet today that are primarily pastoral in their approach to food production. What we tend to think of as agriculture is really the pre-industrial agricultural era, which is probably about 5,000 years from the present date. It focused less on horticultural items of fruits and vegetables and did more in grain planting. Particularly, we saw the first birth of monocultures. And the industrial era did not really invent monocultures. They sort of perfected that, or depending on your perspective, imperfected it. There were some significant problems with this era, though. This was really the era of slavery, and where people were seen as property, serfs, slaves. They also existed in hunting and gathering and horticultural and pastoral ages, but slavery really came to age during this pre-industrial agricultural area. Most of the land was also owned by a power elite. The industrial era started taking place. It's just a blip in radar, although we're trying to transcend past the radar, past the industrial era at this time. It's really only about 250 years ago it really was kind of birthed. And we see that Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, reason and science began to preempt faith and religion and practical matters. We began to create machines that greatly magnified our ability to produce labor, and we developed new energy sources which began to replace human and draft animal labor. I think the key to understand what drives the industrial agricultural system is it's primarily focused on productivity, how to increase productivity and lower cost. And from that goal, it's been amazingly successful. And of course, it also correlates very well with the real rise of capitalism and the market economy that's become the dominant economic form in the last 250 years as well. Also, a great burst of urbanization correlates well with it. We see that mechanization and heavy use of chemicals permits the large, vast monocultural farms that exist today. And that really began to accelerate after World War II, when we had synthetic are artificial fertilizers that predated, but DDT is really kind of a World War II invention. And we really saw the massive use of pesticides that spread after World War II, partly as a result of that. And many of you probably remember Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, that predicted we'd be, well, famine would have already broken out in a mass way. The Green Revolution sort of detoured that situation by through hybrid rices and massive inputs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, we saw massive increases in productivity through the Green Revolution. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which began to seriously question the use of those pesticides, came out in 1962. DDT eventually got banned in the more the developed world, the United States, although it's still used in limited fashion in other parts of the world. We also saw the growth of agribusiness during this time. Major farm acreage consolidation. Lots of small farmers were put out of business, and the whole local food, it's the industrialization of food that began to dismantle local food webs because they couldn't compete on price and productivity, which is what drives that industrial system. We saw the birth and growth of large agribusiness companies like Conagra, Cargill, ADM, Smithfield, and Monsanto. More recently, of course, we have the GMO phenomenon. What's most interesting about that to me is that about 99% of the GMO applications so far have simply been to confer resistance to herbicides and to pests. So it hasn't been for any other purpose. And interestingly, about 92% of Americans through polls indicate they support some type of mandatory labeling. And we're told, of course, that that's really not possible in the United States. It'd be too complex. And yet we see that the EU, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, they all require mandatory labeling. So the question is, why doesn't the USA? Industrial agriculture it rightly gets a lot of criticism. And I just want to, before I do attack it, I do want to point out it's had some benefits. It has created a more uniform food supply. Now, some would say that's not a benefit, but it has resulted in higher levels of sanitation. The yields have increased dramatically, and we now have, in 1950, for example, one farmer could feed 25 people. Today, in the year 2000, one farmer could feed 129 people. And the amount of income spent, disposable income spent on food in the United States to purchase food has now dropped to only 8%. There's also massive social progress that correlates with the industrial agricultural era. Slavery ends in industrial societies. I know it still exists in parts of the world, but it doesn't really exist in industrial societies. If it exists, it's illegal, and it's certainly not common as it was during the agricultural era that predominated it. We've seen radical increases in freedom, democracy, and education. Patriarchal dominance of women begins to wane. Women get the right to vote in 1920. And the average lifespan has radically increased during the industrial era. It went from 49 to 78 in just about 100 years. That's a pretty significant increase. However, there's significant problems, and Michael Pollan brilliantly has outlined many of those problems that the industrial era has produced. Basically, there are no other values are recognized in the industrial system except for high productivity and low cost. There's much increase in fossil fuel usage in the industrial era, and we know that's contributing to global warming. We see that those environmental costs, the pollution impacts they're externalized to the greater society, and they're not being internalized on the balance sheets of the polluters. We also see this obesity epidemic now where cheap processed food, that 8% of disposable income we spend on food, it's making a lot of people fat. And 66% of Americans are now overweight, and 30% are obese. And of course, for me, one of the most serious problems of the industrialization is what it's done to our animal foods. It's increased productivity, they're a lot cheaper, but at what cost in terms of animal welfare, in terms of the quality of the food that's being produced? Over 70% of antibiotics are fed to our livestock animals, 70%. And of course, everyone here knows about the danger of potential immunities that those bacteria can develop if they're exposed to, so superbugs are the danger that can result of that. It's also interesting that so much of the grain and soybeans that are being produced in the world are being fed to our livestock animals. They now consume 33% of the world's wheat, 2/3 of the corn, 3/4 of the barley and soy, and that is equivalent to enough food to feed 2 billion people, or just about 1/3 of the planet's population. What I'm going to show you now, I've got to warn you, is it's pretty disturbing. I'm going to show you 5 minutes of what factory farms are like in the United States today. And I'm sorry if this offends you, but a lot of people are in denial, and I think it's got to be seen.
Between 5 and 11 hens are crammed into tiny wire cages during egg production. The animals might go insane from the oppressive conditions and attack one another, so their beaks, which are filled with nerve endings, are painfully seared off with a hot blade. These hens are so crowded that they are unable to spread even one wing during their entire miserable lives. They are unable to do anything natural, such as dust bathing or foraging through the grass. It takes an average of 34 hours in these conditions to produce just one egg. When egg production drops, producers often shock the bodies of the worn-out birds into another laying cycle by withholding food for up to 14 days. Many die of starvation. Because their bones are so weak and their bodies so worn down, up to 90% of hens have broken bones or are hemorrhaging by the time they make it to slaughter. Even though they give milk for the same reason that humans do, for their babies, on today's dairy farms, mother cows are treated as nothing more than milk machines. 40% of dairy cows are lame by the time they reach the slaughterhouse. They are hooked up to machines a few times per day, machines that often injure them. At the end of their lives, they are either sent straight to slaughter or are sold for slaughter at cattle auctions. More than 100,000 cows are unable to walk off the transport trucks every year, yet they are slaughtered for human food anyway. At a fraction of their natural lifespan, they're shipped to slaughter. Most hamburger in this country comes from spent dairy cows. Cows give milk for their offspring, not for human beings. These mother cows are impregnated annually to keep the milk flowing shortly after birth, which causes both of them profound distress. Many of the males are sold to veal farmers, who cram them into tiny crates where they cannot turn around or even comfortably lie down. If you're consuming milk, you're supporting the veal industry. Confined to tiny stalls that don't even allow mother pigs to turn around for most of their pregnancy, the first time that these animals will breathe fresh air is when they are on the back of a truck headed for the slaughterhouse. Shortly after birth, baby pigs have their ears mutilated, the ends of their teeth chopped off, their tails cut off, and they are also castrated, all without any painkillers. Pigs are often packed so tightly together on unventilated trucks that their limbs snap under the weight of other terrified animals, and they sometimes freeze to the sides of the truck or die of dehydration. In fact, 400,000 pigs who are unable to walk off the truck arrive at the slaughterhouses each year. 100,000 arrive dead. These are industry figures. Some speculate that the real numbers are much higher. After being electrically prodded and forced onto the killing floor, improper stunning causes pigs to endure having their throats slit while they are still awake. Some are burned alive in the scalding tank that is used for hair removal.
Well, I've probably cheered everybody up. But it's a good lead-in to what I really want to spend the rest of the time talking about, which is the new era that I believe is being born today, the ecological era. And the difference between the industrial era and the ecological era is that the ecological era thinks in terms of long-term environmental sustainability instead of productivity maximization. It's not against productivity, only there are other countervailing values that offset that to a certain extent. It tends to think in ecological systems terms with using those types of metaphors instead of machine metaphors. If we trace back its early roots, they go back into the 1920s and 1930s, although there are certain visionaries back in the 19th century that I think would qualify as well. But the real momentum began to be gained in the 20s and 30s. And the food categories that I'm going to talk about tonight that I think are all part of the ecological era are the natural foods, organic foods, local foods, food artisans, ethically traded foods, humanely treated livestock, and sustainable seafood. In a sense, ecological agriculture is attempting to correct the failings of the industrial era. It's a reform movement, and I believe that it's going to grow and evolve, and that it will become the dominant food paradigm over the next 50 years. We're just in the very early stages of it right now. If you compare it to the industrial system, you can see that while the industrial system focuses again on maximizing productivity and low cost, ecological has these other values: the health of the soil, animal welfare, environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in the ecological era is natural or whole foods. And we see that this movement really began in the 60s, 1960s, with the rise of the counterculture. In ways, it was a reaction against the industrial food era. It had characteristics of romanticism, back to nature, holistic, purity, skepticism about all chemical food additives, and a basic faith that nature is good. Those are pictures, top picture of Saferway, my first store back in '78. If you look real hard, you might see me. And then that was our first Whole Foods market back in 1980. Some of the early stores were, the natural food co-ops, of course, were real pioneers in the whole natural foods movement. And they're still leaders in the movement today in many ways. We also see Erewhon, which Paul Hawken was heavily involved in the early days, Alfalfa's, Unicorn, Bread and Circus. And I put Chez Panisse there as well because Alice Waters has been such a visionary for so many years. And you recognize some of the small manufacturers and most of those are still around, even though many of them have been acquired by larger corporations. So what Whole Foods has done in the natural area is that we've rapidly grown and we've consolidated a rather fragmented industry. And you may disagree, but that's been a very good thing for the natural products industry overall because it's helped, our growth has helped thousands and thousands of small producers to grow and to flourish. through our markets. And we've also helped expand the consciousness. Natural and whole foods, as well as organic foods, have begun to enter into the mainstream consciousness, largely through the vehicle of Whole Foods Market. We're also very proud of the fact that we've helped improve the health and well-being now of millions and millions of people. The second area of the ecological area is what I think of as traditional cuisines and artisan foods. Basically, the industrial system and through the growth of certain fast food chains, there's a certain homogenization and standardization of the food supply that's beginning to occur. And yet, almost all countries have long, great traditional cuisines that are a collective human treasure that we need to protect and nurture. And they're food artisans around this planet, but they've been in decline for a long time. And one of the best examples to try to combat that is the slow food movement, which was founded by Carlo Petrini in Italy back in 1986 to promote and protect these traditional cuisines and food artisanship within each unique ecoregion. And it's now grown to have 83,000 members in over 100 countries. What Whole Foods is doing is we recognize the value of these traditional cuisines and the value of food artisans, and we're trying to promote their foods. We're doing it in a couple of ways. We have a program we call Authentic Food Artisan, where we designate food artisans around the world that we think are making food in a really high quality craft sort of way. We're now empowering our stores and our regions to recognize local food artisans in each of their communities and to designate that and to promote it with our customers. More recently, I'm announcing tonight, which has not been announced publicly, that our board has given us permission to establish a $30 million venture capital fund that we're going to use to invest in unique food artisans around the planet. So I'm going to talk in a little bit. I'm going to talk about local foods and Whole Foods local loan program. This is different from that because these are like equity investments rather than a loan that has to be paid back. And we're looking for people that are making the very best food on this planet. And we want to make sure that what they're doing is promoted and not lost and is able to, that other people can pick up on it and that their technologies and their artisanship can spread. Let's talk about organic. These are some of the pioneers of it that you're probably all familiar with: Sir Albert Howard, Rudolf Steiner was one of his many interests, the founder of biodynamic agriculture, J.I. Rodale in the United States. The early organic movement focused on the health of the soil because they perceived the soil as a living system. And basically, healthy soil equals healthy people, well, healthy food, which results in healthy people. And unfortunately, when Whole Foods got started, there was very little organic food. There was no real local organic food in Austin, Texas back almost 30 years ago. It was a little bit, just a little bit. The industrialization had put out of business most of the small producers where I came from. And what was available was a questionable authenticity because there weren't any standards. There weren't any legal standards. We began to procure organic produce from the organic suppliers in California because that's where most of the organic produce was available almost 30 years ago. And I remember the first two suppliers we bought from. One was called Max Kozak, and the other one was called Sunburst Farms. And some of you that have been around for a while know the stories of those. They were both crooks. Max Kozak was caught sticking commercial produce into organic, taking it out of commercial boxes and sticking it into organic boxes. And Sunburst Farms was a commune that was also a bit of a gun cult, and it finally blew up and went out, and we no longer had either one of them as a supplier. Most organic foods today don't come from big organic corporate farms. That is a myth. Although I will not deny the fact that corporate farms are rapidly growing. And we did the calculations, and at Whole Foods, 22% of our organic produce comes from large corporate farms, and 78% comes from independent family farms. 100% of our private label milk is coming from family farms, and with an average herd size of 66 cows. Also, to be controversial, will state that not necessarily are large organic farms necessarily bad. Big is not necessarily bad. They have just as much potential to follow sound agroecological principles as small farms do. The problem is, of course, that many conventional farms are converting over, and they haven't internalized the true philosophy of organic, so they're doing a lot of input substitutions. But it's not necessarily the case that large organic farms can't be ecologically responsible. And I'm going to paint a really big picture of organic here. I'm going to show you what's happening around the entire world. This is the latest statistics that we got in BioFac from iPhone. And organic's grown from $23 billion in sales to $40 billion in sales worldwide. And the United States accounts for about $18 billion of that $40 billion. However, there's not, right now, demand is outstripping supply in the United States. And that's resulting in, and also in Europe, and that's resulting in, a large increase of organic land under production in the United States, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's also resulting in a lot of organic beginning to be imported at a more rapid rate to meet the missing demand. Here we can see in this pie chart, it's very interesting, that actually this includes organic pasture land. So you see that actually Australia, because of their massive amount of organic pasture land, actually has the most organic land in the world. In terms of the total arable land, not pasture, that's under organic production, Europe accounts for 66% of the total. You'll see that North America accounts for 23%. However, the United States is growing the fastest. We have massive growth in organic occurring right now. And Latin America is also, primarily because of American demands, is also growing at a very rapid rate. In terms of organic cereal production, primarily wheat here, you can see that the greatest producer in the world is Italy, with the United States a close second. In terms of organic citrus fruit production, it's not even close. Italy is by far the world's leader in citrus organic production, with the United States ranking number 2, but pretty far down there. Organic cotton, Turkey, by far. United States at about 40%, the Turkish rate. Organic grape production for all the organic wines. See, Italy's first. This is not too surprising. Italy's first, France is second, Spain is third, United States is fourth. Organic rice production. Thailand is first, the Philippines is second. Italy is slightly ahead of the United States, I guess, for the risotto, and the USA is fourth. Tropical fruit production, of course, the United States doesn't, other than, I guess, a little bit in Hawaii, doesn't produce much. Mexico is actually the world's leader in tropical fruit organic production. Paraguay second, Ecuador third. So what are the benefits of organic food anyway? Well, I think most of you probably know, but health, higher nutrient levels, and fewer pesticides, improved soil fertility, increased biodiversity, lessens risk of farm workers for pesticides, fossil fuels are reduced 35 to 50%, and there's a lower impact on global warming, not only because of fossil fuel reduction, but because of carbon being stored in the soil. But organic food system has many challenges. Michael Pollan's been very articulate in pointing out some of them. First of all, they're not cheap. Organic foods are more expensive. And hopefully that will, there are a lot, other than the last couple of years when demand has skyrocketed, the long-term trend we saw at Whole Foods was organic was steadily getting cheaper relative to conventional. The spread was lessening. In the last couple of years, that's turned around because you might say organic has hit the mainstream, and so the demand has really skyrocketed. Organic has inadequate animal welfare standards. That's the bottom line. I think when those standards were being set up, animal welfare was not really of major concern. And again, Michael Pollan has been very articulate in pointing out some of the weaknesses, not only in dairy, but also in chickens, organic chickens. My main gripe about organic is that it's too dominated by negative concepts, such as no artificial fertilizers, no synthetic pesticides, no GMOs, no irradiation. And there are not any positive visions that are articulated into the certification standards, such as soil fertility or animal welfare, environmental sustainability, nutritional quality, the welfare of the workers, and just basically sound agroecological principles. They're just not in place. And a vision that I'm going to throw out there today that I want that Whole Foods is going to be working on in the next decade or so is to create some type of organic farm rating system. So if you're certified for organic, that will give you like a 1-star rating. But if you're practicing the highest levels of agroecological principles, you've got the healthiest soil, your workers are well treated, you have exemplary animal welfare standards, you might get a 5-star rating. And that information can begin to be communicated to the customers. There's a demand for beyond organic, and this type of rating system has the potential to meet that demand. What's Whole Foods doing? Well, all told, we sold over $1 billion in total organic sales in 2006, and about $450 million of that was in organic produce. The supply chain that exists nationally for organic, largely Whole Foods is responsible for that by creating the demand for it, and the outlets for it, and the supply chain, and the trucking, and the distribution for it. We also were heavily involved in creating the National Organic Standards. Margaret Wittenberg served on the Organic Standards Board for 5 years, and we've worked tirelessly to keep these standards from being compromised. We're real proud of that. A lot of Whole Foods people here tonight, I guess. We're also now working to try to upgrade the animal welfare component of the organic standards. This is a real weakness. The dairy cows are not getting access to pasture in any kind of sustainable, measurable way. Chickens might have access to outdoors, but they're not taking advantage of it. There are not good. They don't learn to go outside, basically. So I talked about these other 2 points already. Let's talk about local foods. The most exciting area. Look at that growth. 4,385 farmers markets. It's 140% growth in 12 years, and they only had 340 back in 1970. It's even more interesting in the UK. There was one farmers market in the UK in 1997, 10 years ago. Also, we see explosive growth of community-supported agriculture. So there are numerous benefits for local food. My favorite is they're fresh. Fresh. And so many of the other benefits derive from that freshness. Better taste, higher nutritional value. We also know that there's the potential for personal relationships or connections with the farmers. Local supports independent family farmers. It helps keep rural areas green and out of development. And in many cases, it lessens fossil fuel consumption. However, there are some challenges with local foods. They cost more. If they didn't cost more, the industrial system never would have put most of these guys out of business in the first place. They're not necessarily organic, and they don't necessarily have humane treatment of livestock animals. It does keep more money in the local community, but is that always a good thing? As Peter Singer very articulately talks about in his book, The Way We Eat, him and Jim Mason, there's a risk of community-based selfishness if a community goes too inward. And in addition, some of the fossil fuel savings have been exaggerated by some of the advocates. Food miles, of course, is a big deal right now. It gets a lot of publicity. But in fact, transportation miles are really a relatively minor percentage of the total energy inputs. And retail is even a smaller percentage. Air transport uses twice as much energy as trucking and 20 times more energy than ship or rail. Yeah, it's too bad Michael Pollan picked those asparagus for his dinner. And we did fly those in, but most of the produce, I noticed he didn't pick any organic bananas that were shipped in, because the shipping costs on that are very, very low. This last bullet point is worth, if you live in Berkeley, California, you will use less fossil fuel and will produce less carbon dioxide by buying rice from Bangladesh than if you buy it from California. That's in Peter Singer's book as well, so if you don't like that, you take it up with Peter. The theory is so much of the energy used is used in actually producing the food and processing the food. You can see here that the two biggest users of energy are the processing of the food from the point the farmer sells it to actually the consumers are huge users of energy through refrigerators and cooking the food. Cooking a cup of rice for 45 minutes uses actually a fair amount of energy, particularly if it's electricity. You can see transportation is only 10% of the total energy cost. And interestingly, the middleman, the bad guys, the wholesalers and retailers, are only actually 6% combined, the total energy. What's Whole Foods doing in local? In 2005, we did $122 million in local produce sales, and that was equal to about 14.87% of total produce sales. You can see that we've increased it in 2006. We estimate in 2007 to do about $220 million in local produce sales, and that will be approximately 20% of our total produce sales. At the rate of growth, we should do over $500 million in local produce sales in 2010, and that should be up to about 25% of our total produce sales. So it is very much growing in Whole Foods. Some of the things we're doing, we're supporting farmers markets now in a lot of our parking lots, and over 50 of our stores have regular local farmers markets. We're also promoting local grower conferences around the United States and bringing local growers together and local small manufacturers as well. We've created a program to give loans where $10 million a year is being loaned to local farmers and local producers. We think we're doing a lot. And here's some of the local producer loans. Here's one in Longmont, Colorado, Pumpkin Farm. We loaned $96,000, or we've approved for the loan for it, for a produce packing shed. Here's one in Santa Rosa, Valley End Farm that will go for organic produce for $80,000 for a cooler box. Here's another one for a goat dairy outside of Boulder, Colorado, the Haystack Mountain Goat Dairy, a $50,000 loan to build a nursery for their goat kids. Don't want those goat kids to not be in a nursery. A local food artisan cheese producer in Fort Collins, Colorado, $40,000 for cheese-making equipment. And this one in Florida, a local honey producer. And here near Berkeley, Revolution Foods, Emeryville, California, $95,000. Basically, if the average loan is about $50,000, we can do, how much is that? A couple hundred loans a year. And then every year, we're going to put another $10 million into the system. Typical loan terms are around 5 years, approximately, and we're passing on our cost of capital. So the loan rates are in that 6 to 7% interest rate level. I want to talk about ethically traded foods, and that's kind of the antidote to a strict local focus. And currently, 1 billion people on this planet live on less than $1 a day, and 2.5 billion live on less than $2 a day. And Oxfam, who's not known to be a great supporter of globalization, is a quote from them. I'm going to read, "History makes a mockery of the claim that trade cannot work for the poor. Participation in world trade has figured prominently in many of the most successful cases of poverty reduction, and compared with aid, it has far more potential to benefit the poor." Buying certified organic foods from the developing world, as well as ethically traded foods, does help reduce poverty. One of the greatest crimes that the developed world, the more developed world, is doing is the 29 most affluent countries in the world are currently given over $360 billion a year in subsidies each year. And these subsidies are causing great harm to small farmers in the developing world. Unfortunately, the wealthiest 20% of our farmers, a lot of that's agribusiness, is receiving those subsidies. While 42% of the world lives on less than $2 a day, the average cow in the EU gets $2.50 per day in subsidy support. Some of the things Whole Foods is doing. While promoting the expansion of local agriculture, Whole Foods is committed to purchasing organic products from around the world, and we've purchased over tens of millions of dollars of certified organic produce from developing world farmers. We're also now, I'm going to announce tonight, we're going into partnership with Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance. I actually really want to, I know there's some fair trade people here today, I really want to acknowledge the vision that Fair Trade has had now for many, many years, and they have done great work in the world in terms of helping a lot of really poor people make better lives for themselves. We're also going to be announcing today what we call the Whole Trade Guarantee, and that we're launching a new program in March that will do 5 things. It's going to give a quality guarantee, a price guarantee. We guarantee we're going to match for the farmers the fair trade price or better. Also a labor practices guarantee, an environmental sustainability guarantee, and 1% of sales are going to go to our foundation to help end poverty. From a time standpoint, I can't go into as much detail as I'd like about it, but we're going to be outsourcing the certification for labor practices and environmental sustainability to Fair Trade and to Rainforest Alliance. They're going to actually be competing for our business, for our certification business for us. These are some of the initial products we're going to be getting under the Whole Trade Guarantee. And you'll also see the Fair Trade or the Rainforest Alliance logo on these products as well, depending on who does the certification. 1% of those total sales are going to go to support our foundation. We're working with the Grameen Bank and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Muhammad Yunus. Our first 2 projects, we've only been doing this about a year, but 100% of these loans have been made to women, and we have 100% repayment to date. And the average loan in Costa Rica is a couple $100. It's being used. If you visit these places and see the looks in these women's eyes, the hope and the excitement they have about bettering the lives of their children, it's pretty amazing. Basically, wherever Whole Foods Market is sourcing product, we feel like we have a responsibility as a global citizen to try to support those communities. So we're going to spread this all over the world. And we started with Costa Rica and Guatemala, but in 2007 we're launching projects in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Assam, India. And in 2008 we'll have a project going on in Africa. So we're going to accelerate this at a pretty rapid rate. You saw that horrific video on animal welfare. So I just want to briefly talk about animal welfare at Whole Foods. We've been working for the last 3.5 years with a variety of animal welfare groups to create animal compassionate standards. And we've also discontinued the sale of, many years ago, foie gras, tethered veal, and live lobsters everywhere except for Maine. I lost that vote on Maine. We're also going to create this 5-star rating program that I mentioned for organic. We're going to do that for animal welfare. Our vision is that every animal product that we're selling is going to get a rating of 1 to 5 stars based on its animal welfare. And we also hope to create some type of a multi-stakeholder trade organization that can promote these standards. So Whole Foods is going to try to give these standards to the world. We're going to give up control of these standards over the long term. We don't want these to be Whole Food standards. We want these standards to spread. And they will be based on third-party auditing. And if you're interested in those standards, they are on our website. You can look at them more closely. Our Animal Compassion Foundation is doing research to try to improve agricultural methods in a more humane way. We've donated over $1 million. On seafood, we're consuming over 300 billion pounds of seafood a year as the human race is. And we're fishing out. The North Atlantic cod's been reduced 98% in the last 40 years. Bluefin tunas counts have been greatly reduced. Also, coral reefs are under systematic destruction right now. And whales are still being hunted, believe it or not, in Japan, Iceland, and Norway. It's due to the tragedy of the commons. Nobody owns the ocean. Nobody has a real incentive to not get that last fish for themselves. Also, technologies have become much more adept. There's a huge problem with bycatch. Over 15 billion pounds a year are just bycatch that has no value, is just thrown away. 30% of the fish is now being consumed through aquaculture, but aquaculture has its own issues in terms of environmental issues and animal welfare issues. What Whole Foods is doing in this area, I'll tell you, we're doing a lot, but we're not doing nearly enough. We've discontinued the sale of many fishes that are endangered. We were the first retailer to support the Marine Stewardship Council and to sell their products in the United States. We're in the process of developing animal welfare standards for farm fish. And we really want to encourage everybody to be more conscious in terms of the seafood that they're eating. It is one of the real problem areas on the planet. So this is my final slide, and if we're going to create this ecological era, we're going to have to evolve our thinking. We're going to have to create a new type of mindset. For one, don't romanticize the past. There never was a golden age. They all had their problems. The industrial era expresses a certain type of consciousness, and the ecological era expresses another kind of consciousness. Work to raise your own. Learn to think with a holistic systems mind. See how everything is connected together. And there are multiple bottom lines. Stop the morality play madness. Avoid thinking of these issues in terms of simplistic good guys and bad guys. Corporations are not inherently evil. They simply express the consciousness of their leadership and of the culture that they've created. Imagine the possibility of a conscious capitalism. Sustainability necessarily includes profit. Let your food choices reflect your personal values. Criticize by creating. Michelangelo said that, and he was a genius in many ways. As human beings, we are capable of limitless creativity and an ever-expanding circle of compassion and love. What will Whole Foods has been doing this for about 27, 28 years now, and we're going to keep doing it. But the challenge I want to put out to everybody here is, what are you going to do? What's your contribution going to be to help our planet evolve into the ecological era?